Scientists are calling it the Great Thaw, and it's unfolding in our lifetime. Climate change is causing permafrost to thaw at an accelerating rate, meaning increased risks for the planet and all that live on it. Here in Russia, 2/3 of the country sits on permafrost, but its thaw affects the whole world, releasing greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, one of the main topics for the upcoming UN Climate Change Conference, or COP26, in November. To reach Russia's home of permafrost, we travelled 5,000 kilometres from Moscow. Here lies the frozen land of the Sakha Republic. The region, more commonly known as Yakutia, is almost the size of India. It makes up 20% of Russia's territory, and nearly all of it sits on permafrost. That means the lower layers of ground remain frozen all year. Getting around Yakutia's vast, rugged landscape can be challenging, but this is ground zero of global efforts to track and prevent the thaw of permafrost.
В связи с тем, что у нас наблюдаются изменения климата, и это факт, это везде наблюдается, и мы как-то должны приспособиться к этим изменениям, адаптироваться к этим условиям.
Alexander Zhirkov is a researcher from Russia's Permafrost Institute, established in the 1960s to study the nature and evolution of Siberia's eternal ice. Working here in Yakutia's Amga region, he and his team have drilled holes to send sensors into the permafrost below. They're recording temperatures up to 15 meters underground, and their findings are sobering.
Эти температуры показывают, что все-таки идет потепление мерзлоты. И вот на 10 метрах мы уже наблюдаем -1 градус. Но в настоящий момент, если подняться, вот, допустим, до 5 метров, здесь уже температуры -0,6, -0,5. Это довольно-таки высокие температуры для мерзлоты.
The thaw already has visible consequences, revealing to the naked eye the contours of climate change. Over the past 30 years, this area has transformed from flat land into mounds taller than I am. They're called bilari in the native Yakut language, a result of melting permafrost causing patches of ground to collapse. And they're becoming a more common phenomenon as temperatures continue rising. And as warmer air thaws the frozen ground, it releases carbon trapped in the earth, creating a vicious cycle.
Это органические остатки, да, за счет вытаивания мерзлоты освобождаются парниковые газы, из-за чего усиливается парниковый эффект, ну и, соответственно, увеличивается температура Земли.
The next step for the research team is to experiment with solutions. They'll use a bulldozer to cover this earth with soil to create a buffer zone for the permafrost. Then they'll try it with snow. The hope is that these methods will protect the frozen ground from the warmth of the air. Without such measures, the upward trend in temperatures will continue, a prospect keeping many scientists up at night. Getting to the bottom of permafrost means heading underground. This icy cave sits below the Permafrost Institute. Pavel Zabolotnik wants to demonstrate just how solid it is. He is more optimistic than many of his colleagues, adamant that global warming is cyclical and still well within norms. He believes most permafrost thaw is a result of localized activity.
Да, происходят изменения, да, они есть, но говорить о том, что это будет всемирная катастрофа и всемирный потоп, но это тоже большое преувеличение, потому что температура меняется. Но для того, чтобы у нас здесь началось вот массовое оттаивание мерзлоты, как вот рисуют сценарий, нам надо, чтобы потеплело еще градусов на 8, на 10. То есть тогда мерзлота начнет как бы активно таять. Но опять же, даже тогда это процесс, который будет занимать сотни лет.
But that process is happening faster in Russia's coldest regions. Since the industrial era, the world has warmed by around 1 degree. In Arctic Yakutia, it's twice that. Here in Yakutsk, 3 times. This year's exceptionally hot, dry summer gave rise to the region's worst wildfires in history. All these factors work together to accelerate permafrost thaw. Activists say indigenous groups who know the land see the changes most clearly.
Все люди, которые многие годы наблюдают за природой и знают такие народные приметы, чтобы можно было прогнозировать, какая погода будет сегодня, завтра, через неделю, они говорят, что все эти часы сбились, что теперь эти приметы уже не работают, и уже что-то предсказать они уже затрудняются. Да? Вот это говорит о том, что, вот, конечно, что надо заниматься этим очень серьезно на государственном уровне.
Russia is the world's 4th biggest polluter. In 2019, it released 1.6 thousand metric tons of carbon dioxide. Critics say it puts profit before protection. Authorities have started to acknowledge humanity's role in climate change, but the country's pledge to keep emissions 30% lower than 1990 levels allows for them to continue rising from where they are today. Its offsets, such as forests and peat bogs, are considered insufficient to reverse warming trends. As permafrost thaws, it opens a door to prehistory. The mammoths that used to roam the earth are now released from it. This one is 41,000 years old. Rising temperatures have sparked a boom in the hunt for mammoth remains. Other species have been found along the way.
И здесь вся мамонтовая фауна находится, то есть от лошадей, сайгаков, бизонов до мамонтов, ну и хищники тоже, пещерные львы, медведи и волки.
These cave lion cubs are some of the best preserved specimens.
Это уникально, это единственное в мире.
Released from their frozen tombs by climate change, they've given paleontologists unprecedented insight.
Да, естественно, мерзлота тает, мерзлота разрушается, но, опять же, я бы не сказал, что прямо это катастрофически, но, опять же, оно помогает именно найти какие-то кости, какие-то вот образцы, потому что они очень быстро вытаивают. Потепление климата, скажем, на руку ученым, которые изучают именно вот эту плейстоценовую фауну, чтобы расширить кругозор, расширить знания об этом времени и предугадать, что ждет нас впереди.
The horizon may be concerning, but scientists here say there is still hope. They believe that the current thaw can be slowed. They just have to keep digging for the right solution.
As the far-reaching impact of a changing climate becomes increasingly clear, a crisis is unfolding in California. Beneath the waters of the Pacific Ocean, kelp forests have long been home to a vibrant ecosystem. But warming oceans and other environmental factors have depleted kelp in some areas of the state by as much as 95%.
The California coast, where the western edge of North America meets the Pacific Ocean. A region of rugged beauty, rich biodiversity, and, just off the shore, underwater forests. Kelp, a type of algae, has long grown abundantly here. It attaches to the seafloor, providing food and shelter to thousands of species, pulling carbon from the atmosphere, and reducing ocean acidity.
It's creating habitat for birds, for marine mammals like harbor seals, which we have just out on the rocks here, all sorts of invertebrates, fish, of course.
But warmer ocean temperatures and other environmental changes started a series of events that have devastated California's kelp in the last few years. Up and down large parts of the coastline, what were once dense forests of this giant seaweed have been depleted by as much as 95%.
Just in the last 5 years, it's been very alarming to see kelp, especially along this coast, just disappear. We haven't seen that before.
As California continues to grapple with climate change, its government and scientific community are mobilizing to try and figure out how to save its kelp.
We're here in a patch of the Pacific Ocean, which is still home to a thriving kelp forest. This research team has come out today to dive down and collect kelp sporophyll to take back to their lab.
Sporophyll is tissue at the bottom of the kelp that is key to its reproductive process. Scientists at the University of California, Irvine are studying the kelp and growing it in a controlled environment to understand why some are still thriving.
One of the goals for us is to take different populations of kelp all along the coast, see which ones are the hardiest to these hot temperatures, and then also try to heat them up to see if they can tolerate it in the lab, and then when we place them out back into their habitat, that they are more likely to survive.
This is male and this is female.
It's a process Professor Lamb describes as trying to future-proof the kelp to prepare it for a warmer climate. Soon, they'll put the best strains back in the ocean to see what happens and determine if they could potentially become climate resilient.
May I? Thank you, sir.
About 1,000 kilometers to the north, in the town of Fort Bragg, another project is underway. This one is centered on a species that feeds on kelp, purple sea urchins. These voracious creatures have become a huge threat to the kelp. Scientists suspect the climate crisis played a role in the mysterious die-off of one of their predators, the sunflower star. And that may have swelled the sea urchin population.
Oh, I'm not doing this very nice. Yep, completely empty.
Now starved of the drift kelp that used to come their way, and with a unique ability to stay alive with barely any food, they immediately devour any kelp that tries to regrow.
Urchins kind of got left unchecked and mowed down the forest, kind of like deforestation. They pretty much clear-cutted the kelp forest.
What used to be kelp forests here have become what's known as urchin barrens. Here we see a kelp has had its root-like system destroyed by the urchins. To try and restore the kelp, California is funding efforts to remove the urchins from designated zones.
So it's a state-funded project to see if we can reduce purple urchin numbers down below a certain threshold, and that threshold is 2 per meter squared. So you take a meter and you count the urchin in there, and right now we're about anywhere from 5 to 15 per meter squared, and we want to reduce that to 2 per meter squared.
So I built this one from 91 to 94.
The state has enlisted local commercial divers like John Holcomb and pays them to remove the urchins. That's a boon for divers who depend on harvesting shellfish for their income. They have suffered from the loss of the kelp forests that used to support large shellfish populations.
Some areas change year to year. It varies. So when the kelp didn't show up in 2015, nobody was really concerned. Over time, though, you begin to wonder what's going on. How come there's no kelp? And then when you went in and saw the urchins everywhere and no chance for kelp, anything that was still alive was swarmed and being chewed on.
For now, urchin management on a large scale has little financial incentive. Purple urchins are smaller and have less reliable roe than red urchins, which produce the uni at sushi restaurants. But at this lab, a company called Urchinomics is hoping to change that.
And what we're trying to do is take this low-value pest and transform it into a high-value product.
They have developed a proprietary food source and systems they say can quickly turn even malnourished urchins into something that might appear at a high-end restaurant. If the market is there, the hope is to scale up with purple urchin fisheries up and down the coast. So, what do purple urchins taste like anyway?
So here we go, eating a purple urchin. Let's see how this thing tastes. Wow, that's good. That's really good, yeah.
But whether any of these efforts will be enough to save the kelp is still a big unknown. Kelp forests, which depend on cool waters and exist along about a quarter of the world's coastlines, aren't just disappearing in California.
It's beautiful.
The world's oceans are gradually growing warmer.
Come on in here.
And that means these rich ecosystems are being wiped out across the globe.
We're learning so much from Australia, Canada, all these other places, Norway, that are dealing with these issues and how they're either being successful or not successful in turning that around. So I think there's absolutely a role for the world community to play in addressing kelp as a world issue, as an ocean-wide issue.
And as the efforts to save California's kelp show, the battle against the effects of climate change is increasingly being fought locally, on the ground, and beneath the sea.
The latest report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has signaled code red for humanity. Sea level rise is accelerating and global temperatures are increasing. All this poses an immediate risk for Singapore, a coastal, low-lying city with about 30% of the island less than 5 meters above sea level. I'm venturing into islands off the coast of mainland Singapore to see what answers nature may hold. Our day begins as the sun's first rays illuminate the land. Hiding in plain sight on the coast of Lazarus Island are keen witnesses to the passage of time.
So this is a fossilized coral. It was alive a few thousand years ago. You can't really see right now, it just looks like a regular rock, but then if I start to scrub it, then you can start to see the coral polyps.
The team extracts a sample from the fossilized coral and takes it to the lab to get an estimate of when it was alive.
Yeah, can you see?
Oh yeah, this area is all green. Then they measure the elevation of these corals on the island managed by the Singapore Land Authority.
By comparing that to the elevations of the living one here, we'll know how much sea level actually changed over the past few thousands of years.
So when you collect enough of these data points, what are you trying to achieve?
So the overall aim is to have enough data to try and understand how sea level has changed over longer time periods. This is data that we cannot collect based on tide gauges because back then we didn't have tide gauges installed.
This data can then be used to calibrate a model to project sea level rise, which has already gone up by 14 centimeters from pre-1970 levels. Researchers from the Nanyang Technological University are also studying mangroves for the same reason. Here on Pulau Ubin, off the northeast coast of mainland Singapore, they can zoom into sea levels several thousand years back. Using a technique called coring, they travel back in time with each centimeter into the ground to uncover its evolution into a tropical forest today.
Each 10 centimetres is approximately taking you back 100 to 500 years in Earth's history. And so when we get down to a depth of around 70 centimetres, the material is completely different. We find sandy material indicating an open bay. You go a further 50 to 100 centimetres, you find a mangrove forest. You've got a 2,000-year-old mangrove lying on top of this very, very stiff, compacted clay. So that starts to indicate that this environment here in Pulau Ubin is very, very susceptible to change.
These dramatic shifts happen with subtle temperature fluctuations.
The temperature differences are at most 1 degree C. So what do you think will happen to these environments in the 21st century? We're projecting 3 to 5 degrees C temperature change globally, amplified at the tropics.
The resilience of habitats like mangroves is front and center now as they gain prominence as nature-based solutions to fight global warming. Mangroves make up about 15% of the country's coastline, and one expert estimates that they store about 1.6 million tons of carbon dioxide throughout Singapore.
And these mangroves, as well as mitigating climate change, they also help us to adapt to it. On every tide, there's mud in the water, and all of these tangle of roots slow down the water. That helps any of the mud in the water deposit and settle out and deposit.
So it grows taller and taller.
Exactly, and it might only be a couple of millimeters a year that they can trap these sediments, but hopefully if the pace of sea level rise isn't too great, it's enough, or just enough to keep pace with it.
His team is working on understanding the conditions different mangrove species thrive in.
If you plant them at an elevation that's too low, they'll be flooded too much and they'll drown. If you plant them at an elevation that's too high, they'll get too dried out. The amount of waves that they can tolerate and all these other environmental conditions. I think if we do our homework, then we're going to reduce the risk of these nature-based solutions and get them actually working for us.
Professor Fries is part of an initiative called Restore Ubin Mangroves, made up of volunteers and academics, among others.
So we have a mangrove arboretum.
The National Park Board is working with them to restore close to 6 hectares of mangroves on the island and protect the coastline from erosion.
Here we are in the mangrove nursery, and what typically happens is that we will go out sometimes with our volunteers, right? And we collect all these mangrove seedlings. These are called propagules. We grow them out, and then after that they can be planted out into the mangrove arboretum or into habitat enhancement projects.
They aim to complete restoration at former prawn ponds at Sungai Durian in the southeast of Pulau Ubin by 2024.
A large part of it will be to allow Mother Nature to take its course by creating the most optimum condition for mangrove plants around that area to naturally propagate and recruit and grow baby plants.
They are also looking to protect Ubin's northern coastline, such as by placing rock revetment under eroded mangroves. Soil will be laid underneath to help mangrove plants grow along the structure. National Water Agency PUB is also studying how nature can complement engineered solutions like seawalls and revetments to protect coastlines.
These kind of measures offer multiple benefits. In addition to coastal protection, they can help to enhance the biodiversity and also create utility by incorporating recreational spaces and also help in carbon sequestration.
She says it is a chance to reimagine the country's coastline. But the existential threat posed by climate change looms. Researchers say they cannot rule out sea level rise of up to 5 meters by year 2150 under a high-emission scenario paired with high-impact, low-likelihood events, such as with rapid loss of ice sheets. And the clock is ticking, with COP26 in November touted as the world's best chance to avoid the worst effects of climate change and preserve life as we know it.